Russia shuts Moscow airports after 130 drones. Ukraine pushes deeper again. The silence over Moscow is the loudest sound in geopolitics right now. This is not routine border shelling. This is the new reality. Last night, the air defense systems surrounding the Russian capital were slammed by what sources confirm was an unprecedented swarm. At least 130 drones aimed at the heart of the Russian state. This attack was extraordinary and dangerous. It forced the total, immediate shutdown of all three major Moscow airports: Vnukovo, Domodedovo, and Sheremetyevo. Let me be clear. When the primary gateways to a nuclear power's capital, the lifelines of commerce, diplomacy, and political access, grind to a complete halt, we are no longer talking about mere skirmishes. This is a direct, front-row confrontation. This massive, coordinated aerial assault is the most visceral demonstration yet of the raw force of political will emanating from Kyiv, determined to prove that Russian territory is no sanctuary. This isn't just news. It's a page-turning event. The conflict has vaulted over previous accepted boundaries, pushing the world dangerously toward escalation. For hours, air traffic controllers scrambled, forcing dozens of flights inbound from Moscow to divert across the country. The logistical damage is severe, but the psychological shock waves reverberating through the halls of the Kremlin are far more profound. This was a daring, complex operation. It signals a terrifying maturity in Ukrainian targeting capabilities. These weren't simple reconnaissance flights. Kyiv was aiming for high-value targets. While the immediate reporting focuses on the disruption, intelligence sources suggest the primary goal was to penetrate and disable critical infrastructure and command and control nodes located near the capital. Whether they achieved meaningful operational damage is still being assessed, but the message is unmistakable. Moscow is vulnerable. The official response from the Russian Ministry of Defense was swift, furious, and chillingly direct. Within hours of the airspace closure, Moscow delivered a direct and unusually blunt threat, not just against Ukraine, but aimed squarely at the NATO capitals they claim are actively supporting and orchestrating this shift in strategy. The accusation is explicit. The West is complicit in attempted acts of terrorism against civilian populations. This latest drone blitz is a calculated violation of Russia's most sensitive red line, the security of its core territory. Kyiv is testing, pushing, and perhaps even rewriting the rules of engagement in real time. This retaliatory pressure on Russian urban centers has been carefully crafted, tested, and weighed against potential consequences. They clearly decided the strategic benefit outweighs the risk of massive retaliation. The geopolitical landscape shifts dramatically. The international community, already grappling with deep divisions, is now forced to face the consequence of this radical change in Ukrainian offensive capability. When Moscow's airports are shut down, the veneer of control and stability Russia has desperately tried to maintain for its domestic audience shatters. Russia needs to project strength now more than ever, demanding that the world understand that they will not be intimidated. We are watching the immediate, cascading effects of a resolute response now demanded by the powerful, hardline factions within the Kremlin. The response is coming not just in military action, but in sharp rhetoric aimed at Western support mechanisms. These factions are already demanding expanded retaliation options, pushing for a complete reevaluation of the rules of engagement concerning Western-supplied weapons and intelligence used in attacks on Russian soil. The scale of this drone attack, 130 vehicles in one synchronized push, indicates a significant commitment of resources, underscoring Ukraine's intent to bring the costs of the war home in the most expensive, disruptive way possible. It is a terrifying indicator that the confrontation has expanded, metastasized, and is now threatening the global equilibrium from the air above Moscow. The airports might reopen tomorrow, but the air of impunity Russia once enjoyed is permanently closed. The countdown to Russia's next and potentially devastating move is officially underway. The countdown has started, and what we witnessed yesterday was the military engineering blueprint for catastrophe. This was not a localized strike. This was the mega swarm, over 130 individual vectors aimed directly at the political and military heart of the Russian Federation. The failure of the Kremlin to adequately defend its capital is absolute, and the consequences are driving global events. We need to drill down into the anatomy of failure. For months, Russia has boasted of a sophisticated layered air defense system. The S-400s, the Pantsers, the electronic jamming suites. Yesterday, that system didn't bend, it collapsed. This extraordinary and dangerous operation was crafted specifically to overwhelm and saturate. It exposed a critical vulnerability: the lack of available mobile air defense units, many of which have been stripped from the interior and sent to the front lines where they are now being destroyed. This saturation attack achieved meaningful operational damage, but perhaps more importantly, it achieved unprecedented psychological damage. These drones targeted key infrastructure. Yes, but sources indicate the real focus was on high-value, strategic sites, specifically intelligence and command and control centers just outside the immediate metro area. Ukraine is not just hitting storage depots anymore. They are decapitating the snake. This daring, coordinated effort signals a fundamental page turning in this conflict. The Kremlin is now wrestling internally with the raw force of political will required to answer this humiliation. This is the closest we've come in months to a genuine, uncontrolled spiral, pushing the world dangerously toward escalation. The shock waves from this attack have reached every corner of the Russian security establishment. Moscow is not just angry. Moscow is furious. Today, we saw the most direct and unusually blunt threat issued since the initial invasion began, aiming squarely at the West, accusing NATO members of actively orchestrating the strikes by providing targeting intelligence. This sharp rhetoric is highly revealing. It indicates that Russia is abandoning the pretense that this is solely a conflict with Kyiv. The confrontation has expanded dramatically. Foreign Minister Lavrov stated explicitly that any further attack on the capital region would constitute a crossing of a core strategic red line, demanding a resolute response against those supplying the weapons. We have watched the Russian establishment struggle to define where that red line truly lies. It has been tested, stretched, and now it has been squarely crossed. The immediate internal response from competing factions within the security apparatus, from the FSB to the Ministry of Defense, is demanding expanded retaliation options. They are pushing for actions that were previously considered too risky, too likely to trigger direct involvement from the West. Lavrov's response was carefully crafted. The message is clear: Russia will not be intimidated by these acts of aggression. But the deeper truth is that the strategic calculus of this conflict shifts dramatically every time a drone penetrates deep into Russian territory. The capabilities Ukraine has demonstrated, the range, the precision, the scale, have fundamentally altered the strategic landscape. The question is no longer whether Russia will respond, but how deep that response will go. Are they willing to risk a direct exchange with NATO? The expanded retaliation options being weighed internally include strikes on key logistical hubs far outside Ukraine's immediate borders, or perhaps devastating attacks on critical infrastructure within Ukraine that have been previously spared. The stakes are immense, fueled by pride, fury, and the need to restore a reputation shattered by yesterday's failure. This is geopolitical theater at its most alarming, and we are just watching the prelude to the inevitable act of vengeance. The pressure cooker is now sealed. The pressure cooker is now sealed. What happens when that pressure is entirely internal? We are witnessing the symbolic defeat of Russia's vaunted internal security apparatus. The operational failure to intercept 130 unmanned systems targeted at high-value infrastructure, including military command and control nodes around Moscow and critical infrastructure in the surrounding regions, sends deep shock waves not just across the battle lines, but through the halls of the Kremlin itself. This is an extraordinary and dangerous moment of weakness, exposed for the world to see and utilized by internal political adversaries. The political implosion has begun. Reports confirm that furious confrontations are erupting between the Ministry of Defense and the Federal Security Service. Who allowed this? Who failed to adapt to the mass drone tactics Kyiv has perfected? The catastrophic security failure lands squarely on the shoulders of those tasked with ensuring the absolute, untouchable safety of the capital. This isn't just about anti-air defense. It's about a comprehensive intelligence and deterrence failure that cost the government irreplaceable political credibility. The reaction from the top has not been measured. It is defined by the raw force of political will, demanding an immediate, decisive, and devastating response. This massive, daring attack means the page turning on this conflict is happening in real time, dramatically and violently. We are moving dangerously toward escalation, pushing past the previous, cautious red lines that define targeting parameters. The political calculus shifts dramatically when the perceived safety of the capital is violated so thoroughly. Yesterday's chaos provoked a direct and unusually blunt threat from Russia's foreign ministry spokesperson, stating explicitly that those orchestrating these attacks, and the foreign powers supporting them, will face immediate and disproportionate consequences that pierce Moscow's self-declared red line. This isn't coded diplomacy. This is sharp rhetoric meant to subdue internal factions and project absolute, unyielding resolve externally. They claim they will not be intimidated. While initial assessments suggest the physical, meaningful operational damage was relatively limited, a testament to the sheer size of Moscow's metropolitan area and successful, though late suppression, the symbolic damage is catastrophic. The capital, the undisputed center of Russian power, was successfully and comprehensively breached. The political sense of invulnerability is annihilated. Every single strategy coming out of the Kremlin today, every escalation plan being crafted, tested, and weighed by the Security Council, is a direct, visceral response to this public humiliation and the political fragility it exposed. The demand now is for a resolute response that instantaneously reestablishes deterrence, or at least the perception of it, both domestically and internationally. We are seeing immediate internal calls for expanded retaliation options, pushing beyond current targeting restrictions into infrastructure that, until now, was considered off-limits. The political heat generated by the security failures necessitates a reaction so profound, so devastating, that the memory of 130 drones descending upon Moscow is instantly overshadowed by the overwhelming force of the Russian counterstrike. This internal political crisis, this exposure of fragility, is the closest we've come in months to seeing the Kremlin forced into an irreversible, high-risk strategic gamble. The political confrontation inside the center of power is intensifying, demanding vengeance. The page-turning has been violent, and the next chapter promises unparalleled dangers and expanded retaliation options. The confrontation is now palpable. This drone swarm, numbering well over 100 and forcing Moscow's primary airports shut for hours, is an act that is both extraordinary and dangerous. It is the clearest, most visceral sign yet that the page-turning we anticipated has happened violently, catalyzed by the sheer scale of the attack. Ukraine is demonstrating the raw force of political will, moving past symbolic strikes into sustained, meaningful operational damage deep within Russian territory. This is not a terror strike. It is a crafted and tested strategic doctrine designed specifically to redefine the battle space, and it is known internally as the deep push. Ukraine is now intentionally pushing dangerously toward escalation. They are systematically targeting what are identified as high-value infrastructure targets and, critically, command and control nodes. The goal is simple: paralyze the logistical backbone of the Russian war machine and instill deep uncertainty within the political elite. Kyiv is proving that nowhere, not even the capital, is safe from the daring reach of their indigenous long-range capabilities. The shock waves from these coordinated attacks are reverberating across the Kremlin walls, exposing vulnerabilities that Moscow repeatedly claimed were non-existent. The immediate response from Russia has been absolutely furious. The public messaging is one thing, a predictable denouncement of Western-backed terrorism. But behind closed doors, we are seeing the emergence of powerful factions demanding immediate, disproportionate revenge. This is precisely why the potential for expanded retaliation options has intensified dramatically. Analysts are looking squarely at the strategic calculus being orchestrated within the Russian Security Council. How far are they willing to go to enforce a clear red line that Kyiv seems determined to erase? We are observing some of the sharpest rhetoric of the conflict so far. Yesterday's statement from the Russian Foreign Ministry was a direct and unusually blunt threat, warning that continued Western aid enabling these deep strikes will fundamentally alter the nature of the conflict and necessitate unprecedented countermeasures. This is not casual saber-rattling. This is a crisis point defined by rhetorical conflict, where the political will of one side directly challenges the military impunity of the other. Every single move, every target selection by Ukraine's deep strike unit has been meticulously weighed against the potential Russian backlash. Kyiv is testing Moscow's true resolve, exploiting the political pressure the Kremlin faces to demonstrate absolute control. The operational reality shifts dramatically with every successful strike that penetrates Russian air defenses. Ukraine is proving it will not be intimidated by historical red lines or nuclear posturing. Their resolute response is to push deeper, wider, and more aggressively. This daring commitment to the deep push doctrine, hitting military bases, oil refineries, and now civilian transportation hubs, is forcing the Kremlin's hand into an even more severe strategic predicament. The question is whether Moscow can deliver a resolute response that effectively halts these attacks without tipping the entire geopolitical balance dangerously toward escalation. The price of appearing weak to the hardliner factions inside Russia is far greater than the perceived risk of a wider confrontation for the Kremlin right now. This confrontation is accelerating, moving us closer to the brink than we have been in months. The page is turning again, and this time we are holding our breath. This latest surge, targeting Moscow's air domain with 130 drones, forcing the extraordinary and dangerous shutdown of its primary international gateways, Sheremetyevo, Domodedovo, Vnukovo. This is the seismic event that truly triggers global aviation paralysis and sends profound, immediate economic shock waves across continents. We are no longer discussing skirmishes near the front lines. We are discussing the immediate, tangible disruption of one of the world's largest capital cities, a city which until recently believed itself immune to such comprehensive kinetic action. The immediate fallout is not just political. It is measured in lost cargo, stranded passengers, massive reinsurance costs, and a fundamental reevaluation of risk across the entire Eurasian air corridor. Global insurers are scrambling. Airlines, already operating on razor-thin margins and navigating complex geopolitical sanctions, now face the reality that Russia's airspace, even for ostensibly friendly or neutral carriers, is unstable, subject to sudden closures and potential hazard. This targeting of operational high-value infrastructure shows a determination by Kyiv not just to strike targets, but to achieve meaningful operational damage designed to expose the failures of Russia's air defense and its central command and control apparatus. When 3 of the largest airports in a G20 capital are simultaneously forced offline, that failure is magnified across every international finance ledger. The strategic choice here is profoundly daring. These are not symbolic hits. They are strikes aimed at paralyzing the very arteries of Russian transport and commerce. The cumulative effect of these repeated aviation disruptions creates a logistical nightmare, not just domestically, but for all nations still reliant on or operating within Russia's transport matrix. The economic pressure exerted by this level of operational uncertainty is exponential, and it is entirely intentional. This is the raw force of political will applied directly against infrastructure. The Kremlin's response has been predictable in its speed, but unusually furious in its tone. We are seeing sharp rhetoric from Moscow, a direct and unusually blunt threat that indicates their perception of a violated red line. They place the responsibility for these strikes squarely on the Western allies, accusing them of orchestrating the attacks through intelligence sharing and material support. This is the moment where rhetorical confrontation dangerously toward escalation. For Washington and Brussels, the calculus shifts dramatically. They must now navigate an environment where their proxies are achieving greater success inside Russian territory than ever before, simultaneously increasing the global risk profile of the war and demanding a resolute response from Moscow. Every Western capital must now answer the fundamental question: how do we respond to Russia's inevitable, expanded retaliation options when that retaliation is justified, in the eyes of the Kremlin, by the actions taken against its capital's high-value transport hubs? The page is turning yet again, and the chapter we are entering is defined by the erosion of the geographical sanctuary Russia had long maintained. The pressure on the Russian military leadership is immense, driven both by internal hardliner factions and the visible, undeniable embarrassment of their air defense failure over Moscow. The silence from key Western capitals is deafening, a tacit acknowledgement of the severity of the crisis and the necessity of allowing Kyiv to continue testing the limits of Russia's tolerance. The implications for international business and travel are chilling. If a major hub like Moscow cannot guarantee continuous, safe operations, what does that signal to Beijing, to Delhi, to Tehran, nations that maintain robust trade links with Russia? It signals risk. It signals failure. The tools for retaliation are being crafted, tested, and weighed in Moscow right now. The message from the Kremlin is clear. We will not be intimidated by these operational successes, But this level of operational damage demands a proportional, or perhaps disproportionate, counterblow. We are in the closest we've come in months to seeing how far the major powers are willing to let this extraordinary and dangerous confrontation run. The closest we've come in months to seeing how far the major powers are willing to let this extraordinary and dangerous confrontation run. This isn't just a military moment. This is a page-turning event driven entirely by the raw force of political will. We are looking at a moment where military strategy is secondary to the need for political demonstration. The attack on Moscow was more than just a cluster of synchronized drone strikes. It was a daring, high-value challenge to the state's ability to defend itself. It was calculated to inflict meaningful operational damage and, perhaps more crucially, psychological trauma across the entire capital region. The fact that dozens of systems could penetrate the defensive rings protecting the Kremlin's core command and control nodes means that Russia's political leadership is now under extraordinary and dangerous pressure from within its own ranks. We have seen the immediate aftermath of this realization. Moscow is absolutely furious. The Kremlin's initial response came not in the form of action, but a direct and unusually blunt threat, delivered through channels that bypass the usual diplomatic niceties. This threat did not stop at accusing Kyiv. It placed the blame for orchestrating these strikes squarely on NATO members, escalating the confrontation dramatically. This sharp rhetoric, signals that the pre-existing, unofficial rules of engagement are collapsing. For months, perhaps even years, there existed a semi-permeable red line. An unspoken agreement that while certain military assets or logistics could be struck, attacks deep into civilian population centers or on core governmental infrastructure of the opponent's capital were generally avoided, or at least minimized, to prevent things moving dangerously toward escalation. That tacit agreement is now gone. The 130 drones that shut down Vnukovo and Domodedovo were not an isolated incident. They were a collective declaration that no target is safe. Experts we consulted over the last 12 hours uniformly agree that Russia will not be intimidated. This level of violation demands an inevitable, resolute response, one that will redefine the geographic and tactical limits of this war. The internal pressure from various political factions, compounded by the humiliation of the capital being paralyzed, means that the response must be visible, impactful, and disproportionate. It cannot be merely symbolic. We are tracking reports that Russia has activated and is preparing to utilize expanded retaliation options. These operational plans have been crafted, tested, and weighed by the General Staff for just such a scenario. Until now, they remained on the shelf, constrained by the fear of invoking Article 5 or triggering a full-scale intervention. But if the Kremlin believes the West is already orchestrating these attacks, as their sharp rhetoric implies, then that constraint has vanished. The political calculus shifts dramatically. The goal now is to hit targets that will send shock waves across the globe, targets that demonstrate total operational freedom. We are talking about critical Ukrainian energy infrastructure previously protected, the deepest logistics depots receiving Western aid near the Polish border, or perhaps even the core data transmission hubs essential for Kyiv's political and military operations. These are high-value, high-risk targets. This is the pathway to unchecked deep strike warfare. When both sides feel that the implicit red line has been irrevocably crossed, and the raw force of political will dictates that maximum pressure must be applied, then all targets become available. The war shifts from a contained conflict to a systemic assault on the opponent's functionality. The question is how deep this new phase will run. The closest we've come in months to seeing the gloves come off means we must prepare for the largest, most destructive wave of strikes yet seen. The world watches, waiting for Russia's answer to this extraordinary and dangerous confrontation. When that answer comes, it will define the future threshold of global conflict. It is a terrifying page-turning moment.